All right. Uh, when we say something like it has to be a certain way, what does that even mean, like philosophically? I mean, are we talking about physical laws here or, something deeper? Like when we talk about what we ought to do or what's forbidden, is there some kind of logical structure behind those oughts and musts?
Yeah, you've hit on some pretty fundamental questions there. And those are exactly the kinds of questions that deontic logic tries to grapple with.
So, for our listeners who are joining us on this deep dive, deontic logic is all about the logic of norms, right? It's about figuring out what we can say, logically speaking, about things being permissible, obligatory, forbidden, and so on.
Right, it's trying to bring that same kind of rigor that we see in, say, classical logic to the realm of ethical and normative concepts.
And what's really interesting is that deontic logic has some deep connections to other areas of logic. For our philosopher listeners, you'll appreciate this. It has some interesting links to alethic modal logic, the logic of necessity and possibility.
Yeah, philosophers have noticed these connections for centuries, actually, as early as the 10th century in Islamic thought and even before the 14th century in Europe.
So, what they saw were these parallels between how we reason about what must be true and what could be true, and how we reason about what's required of us and what's allowed.
Exactly. And this early recognition of similarities led to what we call the traditional scheme of demontic notions, which lays out the basic concepts like obligatory, permissible, impermissible, and so on. And here's where the link to modal logic gets really interesting. If you look at the formal definitions of these deontic terms, they have a striking resemblance to the definitions of modal terms. It's almost as if they're just syntactic variants of each other.
So, this connection isn't just some vague analogy, there's a real formal similarity there.
Right. This extends to other areas as well, like the deontic square of opposition, which maps out the relationships between these deontic terms. It actually has a very similar structure to the modal square in alephic logic, and even the square of opposition you see in predicate logic with quantifiers.
Yeah.
Kind of points to some underlying unity in how we think about different kinds of logical relationships, wouldn't you say?
I mean, that's fascinating, but of course, there are some crucial differences too, right? Like, obligations can be violated, people don't always do what they ought to do, and sometimes they do what's forbidden.
Absolutely, and that's a really crucial point. That's a major difference from alethic necessity. If something's necessarily true, then it has to hold in every possible world. No exceptions. But obligations, not so much.
And this fact that, obligations can be broken, that's really what makes deontic logic a much trickier area to formalize. It raises all sorts of unique logical challenges.
It really does. It forces us to think carefully about what it means for something to be required in a world where things don't always go as they should.
So moving on from these sort of general connections, let's talk about standard deontic logic, or SDL. This is kind of like the foundational system in deontic logic, right?
Yeah, SDL, you can think of it as a kind of benchmark system. It's the one that's most often cited and built upon. Essentially what it does is it takes the structure of a normal modal logic, like the kind you might use for necessity and possibility, and it adapts it to deal with obligation.
So at the heart of SDL is this monadic deontic operator, usually symbolized as OB, which basically means it is obligatory that.
Right, and from this single operator, you can actually define all those other concepts from the traditional scheme, permissible, impermissible, and so on. It's a very elegant and economical system in that way.
So what are the fundamental principles that SDL is built on?
Well, it includes all the standard tautologies from propositional logic, of course, and then it adds some specific axioms and rules to deal with obligation. For instance, it includes a version of the K axiom adapted for obligation, which basically says that if it's obligatory that if P, then Q, and it's obligatory that P, then it must also be obligatory that Q.
Right, kind of like a chain of obligations. If you're obligated to do one thing that leads to another, you're obligated to do that second thing as well.
Exactly. And SDL also has the no conflicts axiom, which says that something can't be both obligatory and obligatorily not the case. That would be a pretty strange situation, right?
Maybe a contradiction, wouldn't it?
Exactly. And SDL includes standard rules like modus ponens and also the necessitation rule. This rule says that if a proposition, let's say P, is a theorem of logic, a logical truth, then it's obligatory that P.
Now, I'm sure our philosopher listeners will have a lot to say about these axioms, especially that last one, and we'll come back to some of those debates later on. But for now, is it fair to say that SDL gives us this sort of baseline framework for analyzing obligations, even if it might not be the final word on the matter?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. It's a good starting point. And it does capture some of our basic intuitions about how obligations work, logically speaking. Like, it can prove things like It's not obligatory to do something that's impossible, or if you're obligated to do two things together, then you're obligated to do each of them individually. And importantly, it supports the rule of replacement of equivalence, which means you can substitute logically equivalent formulas within the scope of the obligation operator. And that's really important for showing how all those deontic concepts are interconnected, like in the traditional scheme.
Okay, so we've got this axiomatic system, but to really understand what these obligations and permissions mean, we need to look at the semantics, right? Like how these concepts are interpreted in a model.
Right. And that's where the idea of possible world semantics comes in, which I think a lot of our philosopher listeners will be familiar with from modal logic.
So remind us, how does possible world semantics work for SDL?
Well, imagine a whole bunch of possible worlds, each representing a different way things could be. And then for each world, we define this relation called an acceptability relation. So world J is acceptable from the perspective of world I if everything that's obligatory in world I is actually true in world J. You can think of these acceptable worlds as the worlds that meet all the obligations of world I.
So the acceptable worlds are kind of like the morally ideal worlds relative to a given world.
That's one way to think about it, yeah. And this acceptability relation has to have a property called seriality. That means every world has at least one world that's acceptable from its perspective. And this is really important because it guarantees that there are no fundamental conflicts and obligations. It would be impossible for something to be both obligatory and obligatory not the case, because there would have to be an acceptable world where both of those contradictory things are true. And that can't happen.
So seriality is kind of the semantic counterpart to that no conflicts axiom we talked about earlier. It ensures that at least one world lives up to the obligations of any given world.
Exactly. And based on this acceptability relation, we can then define what it means for something to be obligatory, permissible, and so on in a given world. So a proposition is obligatory in world if it's true in all the worlds that are acceptable for I. And it's permissible if it's true in at least one acceptable world, and so on. So it's all about what holds in these morally ideal or acceptable worlds.
So the truth of a deontic statement is determined by what happens in these special acceptable worlds.
Precisely. And it's worth noting that not every principle that might seem intuitively valid is automatically valid in these standard models. Some require imposing additional constraints on the acceptability relation. Like that principle we mentioned earlier about if it's obligatory that P is obligatory, then P is obligatory. That one's not valid in standard serial models. It needs a stronger condition called secondary seriality to be validated.
And you also mentioned earlier that there's this alternative semantic approach called ordering semantics. How does that work?
Right, so ordering semantics takes a slightly different approach. Instead of having just a binary relation of acceptability, it uses this idea of a world relative preference ordering. So for each world, you got this ranking of all the other worlds based on how good or ideal they are in terms of fulfilling obligations. And then with an important assumption called the limit assumption, which basically makes sure there's always a best world in this ranking, you can define obligation as being true in all the maximally preferred worlds.
So it's like each world has a ranking of other worlds based on how well they fulfill its obligations. And the most obligatory things are those that hold in the very best worlds according to this ranking.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that even though it uses a different conceptual framework, this ordering semantics actually ends up characterizing the same set of valid formulas as the standard Kripke-style possible world semantics we were talking about before.
So it's like two different ways of looking at the same underlying logic.
That's right. And the idea of these preference orderings actually becomes really important when you move to more sophisticated deonic logics, particularly those designed to handle conditional obligations and things like that, which, as we'll see, SDL struggles with a bit.
Okay, so we've looked at these model theoretic interpretations of SDL, but there's also been this really interesting attempt to connect it back to more traditional logic with what's called the Andersonian-Kangurian reduction.
Yeah, this is a really clever idea. It tries to define deonic concepts using the framework of standard alethic modal logic, but with a special twist.
So how does this reduction actually work?
Well, the key is to add a special deontic constant to your modal logic, usually symbolized as D. And you can think of this constant as representing the state of affairs where all normative demands are met, like the ideal moral situation.
So it's like a proposition that stands for everything that ought to be the case is the case.
Yeah, exactly. And then the reduction works by defining it is obligatory that P as it is necessary that if D, then P. In other words, P is obligatory if it holds in every possible world where all the normative demands are met.
That's pretty slick. So by adding this one special constant, you can essentially reduce all of deontic logic to allethic modal logic.
That's the idea.
Mm.
And it turns out that all the theorems of SDL can be derived within this extended modal system and vice versa. So they're really closely related systems from a formal point of view.
So deontic logic, in a sense, is just modal logic with a special proposition added to represent the moral ideal.
Well, it's a bit more complicated than that. I mean, there are some philosophical questions about how exactly you interpret this constant D. If its meaning already presupposes some notion of obligation, then the reduction might be circular. But if you can give it a non-circular interpretation, then it might be a really illuminating way of understanding the nature of obligation.
Yeah, like if D just means something like ideal circumstances, and we can define that without appealing to obligation, then that would be pretty powerful.
Right. And there are different versions of this reduction. Like Anderson's approach actually uses a sanction constant instead of a deontic constant. So for him, obligation is defined in terms of what would necessitate a sanction. But that raises its own philosophical issues, of course.
So, like, is a sanction inherently a normative concept? Does it already bake in some idea of right and wrong?
Exactly. These are all questions that philosophers are still debating. But the Andersonian-Kangerian reduction is a really fascinating attempt to ground deontic logic in a more familiar system, like elliptic modal logic, and it raises all sorts of interesting philosophical questions along the way.
Okay, so now let's talk about a place where SDL really starts to run into trouble. Conditional obligations. And specifically, the infamous Chisholm's puzzle, which really highlights some of SDL's limitations.
Yeah, Chisholm's puzzle is a classic example of how things can get really tricky when you start dealing with obligations that depend on certain conditions.
For our listeners who might not remember the specifics of this puzzle, can you quickly recap the four premises?
Sure. So the puzzle goes like this. It ought to be that Jones goes to assist his neighbors. It ought to be that if Jones goes, then he tells them he's coming. If Jones doesn't go, then he ought not to tell him he's coming. And finally, Jones doesn't go.
So each of those premises seems perfectly reasonable on its own, right? Like they could all be true in some scenario.
Right. But the problem is that when you try to formalize these premises in SDL, using the standard obligation operator and the material conditional, you run into inconsistencies. Like, you can derive both that Jones ought to tell them he's coming and that he ought not to tell them, which is a direct contradiction.
And the problem isn't just limited to using the material conditional. Other attempts to formalize the puzzle using different interpretations or different scopes for the obligation operator also lead to problems. Either they can't capture all the premises without contradiction, or they end up making some of the premises logically dependent on each other when they should be independent.
Exactly. So Chisholm's puzzle really forces us to think hard about how we represent these conditional oughts logically. And it highlights this important distinction between two types of detachment: factual detachment and deontic detachment.
Can you unpack those two types of detachment for us?
Sure. Factual detachment is the principle that if P is true, and if P, that it ought to be that Q, then it follows that it ought to be that Q. So you're detaching the obligation from the conditional based on the fact that the antecedent is true. Deontic detachment, on the other hand, says that if it ought to be that P, and if P, then it ought to be that Q, then it follows that it ought to be that Q. So here you're detaching based on an obligation, not a fact.
So in factual detachment, the if P part is a fact, and in deontic detachment, the if P part is an obligation.
Precisely. And Chisholm's puzzle shows that SDL can't really handle both of these principles at the same time, especially when it comes to what we call contrary to duty obligations. These are obligations about what you should do when you've already violated some primary obligation. And the puzzle shows that different ways of formalizing conditional obligations in SDL will typically validate one of these detachment principles, but not the other, which is a big problem.
So we need to move beyond SDL if we want to deal with the full complexity of conditional obligations.
Yeah, it seems that way. And there are a couple of main approaches that have emerged to try and address this.
So what are some of the ways deontic logicians have tried to fix this?
Well, one approach focuses on using non-material conditionals to represent the if-then in conditional obligations. So instead of the standard material conditional from classical logic, you use something like a counterfactual conditional, which has a stronger interpretation. The idea is that the obligation in a contrary to duty statement should hold even if the antecedent of the conditional is false, because it's telling you what you should do in that hypothetical situation.
So even if Jones doesn't go, there's still this separate obligation that if he did go, he should tell them. It doesn't just become vacuously true because he didn't go.
Exactly. But this approach also has its problems, like the famous gentle murder objection. If it's absolutely forbidden to kill someone, but we somehow know that someone will be killed, does it then become obligatory to kill them gently? Because if you're going to kill them anyway, and killing gently is better than killing brutally, it seems like the factual detachment with this strong conditional would imply that you're obligated to kill them gently. And that's obviously a very counterintuitive result.
Right, because you'd still want to say that killing is wrong no matter how it's done. It shouldn't become obligatory just because someone else is going to do it anyway.
Exactly. So the challenge for this approach is to find a way to use these stronger conditionals without leading to these kinds of absurd consequences.
Okay, and what about the other approach you mentioned, the one that focuses on deontic detachment?
Right, so this approach typically uses dyadic obligation operators. These are operators that represent obligations that are explicitly conditional on some other proposition.
Hmm.
So instead of just having OBP, you would have something like OBQ given P. And the idea is that these conditional obligations are kind of fundamental. They're not just derived from some regular obligation applied to a material conditional.
So it's like saying, if P, then it's obligatory that Q is a basic unit of normative meaning, not something built up from simpler parts.
Exactly. And this allows you to say that even if Jones doesn't go, the conditional obligation that if he goes, he should tell them, still holds. It doesn't just disappear because the antecedent is false.
But if these dyadic operators are taken as primitive, how do they relate to regular conditionals? And how do you get back to that unconditional obligation?
Yeah, that's the tricky part. This approach needs to explain how these conditional obligations connect to the broader logic of obligations. And they typically do this by allowing for some restricted forms of factual detachment, like when the antecedent, the conditional obligation, is necessarily true.
So it's like a balancing act. You want to capture the intuition behind deontic detachment without making factual detachment too strong and leading to those absurd results.
Precisely. And there's still a lot of debate about how exactly to do that and what the best way is to formalize these dyadic operators and their connection to the rest of logic.
It's fascinating to see how this one puzzle, Chisholm's puzzle, has pushed deontic logic in all these new directions.
Absolutely. It really highlights the complexity of conditional obligations and the challenges involved in creating a formal system that can adequately account for them.
Okay, so we've seen how SDL struggles with conditional obligations, but the source also pointed out some other expressive limitations, even when we're just dealing with regular non-conditional obligations.
Right. Even in those simpler cases, SDL can't really capture all the nuances of our normative reasoning.
Like the difference between something being optional and something being morally indifferent.
Exactly. In SDL, something's optional if it's neither obligatory nor forbidden. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's morally neutral. Like, attending a faculty meeting might be optional, but it's probably not a good idea to just skip it without a good reason. There might be certain expectations or moral considerations involved, even though it's not strictly obligatory.
Right, like maybe there are obligations to your colleagues or to the smooth functioning of the department.
Exactly. So FDL doesn't have a way to distinguish between something being optional in the sense of you're not required to do it, and being optional in the sense of it doesn't really matter morally whether you do it or not.
And what about the difference between saying that someone must do something and saying that they ought to do it? Those seem to have slightly different meanings, but SDL doesn't really distinguish between them, does it?
Right, you're getting at this really interesting issue about the strength of different normative modalities. Like, consider this sentence: even though you can skip the meeting, you ought to attend. The can there seems to be talking about something stronger than just the standard permissibility in SDL, which is basically just the absence of an obligation not to do something. It's more like saying, you're able to skip it, but it would be better if you didn't.
Yeah, so there are different levels of can and maybe even different levels of ought as well.
Exactly. And SDL's framework is too simple to capture all of that.
And then there's this interesting notion of the least one can do, which the source brought up.
Right. This is a kind of minimal requirement that kicks in when you've already violated some other obligation.
Yeah.
Like if you were supposed to be home at a certain time, but you were late, we might say the least you could have done was call to let us know. It's not like you were obligated to call, but given that you were already late, it was kind of the minimal acceptable thing to do.
So it's a weaker kind of obligation that arises in response to a previous violation.
Yeah, you could think of it that way. And SDL doesn't have a good way to represent these kinds of weaker requirements or this idea of a least acceptable alternative.
And what about those concepts of supererogation and suboptimal action? Like, what if someone does something that's really good beyond what's required? Or what if they do something that's technically allowed but not the best choice?
Right. Those are both cases where SDL's simple division of actions into obligatory, permissible, and forbidden isn't fine-grained enough. It needs a more nuanced framework to capture those distinctions.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about obligation, but a really crucial aspect of norms is the idea of agency. It seems essential to distinguish between what ought to be the case and what someone ought to do.
Absolutely. The latter explicitly involves an agent performing an action, whereas the former can just describe states of affairs.
So how do you formally represent this notion of agency within deontic logic?
One common approach is to introduce an agency operator into the formal language. So you might have something like BA, which means agent A brings it about that P. This allows you to talk about who's responsible for making certain things happen.
So now you can not only talk about what ought to be the case, but also about who ought to make it the case.
Exactly. And this opens up all sorts of interesting possibilities. Like you can distinguish between being obligated to refrain from doing something and being obligated to bring about the negation of something. Those might seem similar at first glance, but they can have different logical consequences.
So like not breaking a vase versus actively preventing someone else from breaking it. Those would both lead to the vase not being broken, but they're different kinds of obligations.
Precisely. And a really important idea in this area is the Meinong-Chisholm reduction, which tries to connect these agent-relative obligations to the more basic kind of obligation that SDL focuses on.
So how does that reduction work?
Well, the idea is that Agent A is obligated to do P if and only if it ought to be the case that Agent A does P. So it's reducing ought to do to a combination of ought to be and this agency operator. It's saying that the obligation to act is really just an obligation about a certain kind of state of affairs, namely a state of affairs where the agent performs the action.
So my obligation to pay my taxes is really just an obligation for a state of affairs to obtain where I'm the one paying the taxes.
That's the basic idea. But this reduction has also been challenged, most notably by Michael Horty, who argued that there are cases where it seems to break down.
Like his famous gambling example.
Right. In that example, it might be that the best outcome overall involves an agent gambling and winning. So you could say it ought to be the case that the agent gambles. But it doesn't seem like the agent is actually obligated to gamble. There might be other considerations, like the risk involved, that make it permissible for them to not gamble, even though it leads to a less ideal outcome.
So there's a difference between saying that something should happen and saying that someone should make it happen.
Exactly. And Horty's argument suggests that the Meinong-Chisholm reduction might not be capturing that distinction properly.
And the source also mentioned the concept of normative positions. What are those?
Normative positions are a way of systematically categorizing all the different ways an agent can relate to a proposition, taking into account both their agency and the relevant deontic statuses. So you combine different modes of agency like bringing about P, bringing about not P, or being passive towards P with different deontic evaluations, and you get this whole matrix of possible normative positions for an agent.
So it's like a comprehensive map of all the different ways an agent can stand, normatively speaking, with respect to a particular proposition.
Exactly. And it helps us understand how different combinations of agency and obligation can lead to different normative judgments.
And there was also this principle called the strict deontic complement thesis, or SDCT. What was that about?
The SDCT basically says that any fundamental deontic operator has to be followed by an operator that specifies an agent. So instead of just saying it's obligatory that P, you'd have to say something like it's obligatory for agent A to bring about P. The idea is that all basic deontic statements are ultimately about what agents are required or allowed to do.
So it's taking that agency component really seriously, making it a fundamental part of the logic itself.
Exactly. And it's an interesting thesis, but it's also been debated, with some people arguing that there can be fundamental obligations about states of affairs that aren't tied to any particular agent.
Okay, so we've focused a lot on the internal workings of deontic logic, but in the real world, norms often interact with other kinds of concepts, right? Like temporal considerations or what we know and believe.
Absolutely. And that's why deontic logic has been extended to interact with other modalities like temporal logic, epistemic logic, and doxastic logic.
So can you give us some examples of how these other modalities come into play?
Sure. Take temporal logic, for example. A lot of our obligations have a time element to them. We're obligated to do certain things at certain times or within certain time frames, and obligations can arise and disappear over time.
Right, like I have an obligation to teach my class tomorrow, but that obligation didn't exist a week ago, and it'll be gone after the class is over.
Exactly. So integrating temporal logic into deontic logic allows you to capture that dynamic aspect of obligations.
And what about epistemic and doxastic logic? Those are the logics of knowledge and belief, right?
That's right. And they're important because sometimes what we're obligated to do depends on what we know or believe. Like, if you believe a certain product is made using unethical labor practices, you might have a moral obligation to not buy it. Or a doctor has an obligation to be knowledgeable about certain medical facts.
So there are obligations that are conditional on our beliefs or knowledge.
Exactly.
Oh.
And these kinds of obligations can lead to some really tricky paradoxes, like the paradox of epistemic obligation. But that's a topic for another deep dive.
Maybe we'll tackle that one next time. Okay, so we've seen that SDL has all these limitations and has led to all these interesting extensions and revisions, but the source also mentions some even more fundamental challenges to the whole idea of deontic logic, like this thing called Jurgensen's dilemma.
Yeah, this dilemma goes right to the heart of what it means for there to be a logic of norms. It stems from the idea, which was popular among logical positivists, that you can't assign truth values to normative statements. Like, you
Why?
can't say that this statement, stealing is wrong, is true or false in the same way that you can say the sky is blue is true or false.
Right, because moral statements seem to be expressing something different from just facts about the world. They're more like prescriptions or commands.
Exactly. So the dilemma is this. If normative statements don't have truth values, then how can there be a logic of norms? Traditional logic is all about inferences between propositions that have truth values. But we clearly do reason about norms in a way that seems logical. So either our reasoning about norms isn't really logical, or we need a different concept of logic altogether.
That's a pretty serious challenge. How do you even begin to address that?
Well, one way is to distinguish between norms themselves and propositions about norms. So the norm "don't steal" might not have a truth value, but the statement, according to the law, it's forbidden to steal, does have a truth value.
So deontic logic would then be about the logic of these propositions about norms rather than the logic of the norms themselves.
Exactly. That's one way to get around the dilemma. But it still leaves open the question of what the logical structure of normative systems is like. Like, how do we get from the norms themselves to these truth-evaluable propositions about them?
And the source also mentioned this other radical approach called procedural semantics, specifically this thing called input-output logic. How does that work?
Input-output logic takes a very different approach to deontic logic. It's not concerned with truth values at all. Instead, it focuses on how obligations are derived from a given set of norms and factual information. It's kind of like a rule-based system. You have these conditional norms, like if P, then it ought to be that Q, and then you have some factual premises, and the logic tells you what obligations follow from those inputs.
So it's like a logical recipe. You plug in the norms and the facts, and it spits out the obligations.
That's a good analogy.
Mhm.
And this approach is good at capturing certain aspects of deontic reasoning, like factual detachment, but it also faces challenges when dealing with more complex things like nested obligations.
So there are still some kinks to work out, but it's an interesting alternative to the more traditional truth-conditional approaches.
Definitely.
The source also discussed a more fundamental revision that involves applying deontic terms directly to actions rather than to propositions.
Yeah, this is a shift away from talking about what ought to be the case towards talking about what agents ought to do. So instead of saying it's obligatory that you open the door, which is a proposition about a state of affairs, you would say you must open the door, which is directly about an action.
So it's bringing the logic closer to the way we actually talk about obligations in everyday life.
Exactly. And there are a few different ways to do this formally. Like, some approaches use dynamic logic, which is specifically designed to deal with actions, and they define obligation in terms of what actions would violate certain norms.
So, like, an action is forbidden if performing it would necessarily lead to a violation.
That's the basic idea. And other approaches use a Boolean algebra of actions, which allows you to talk about combinations of actions and their deontic status.
So you could say things like doing action A and action B is permissible, but doing action A by itself is forbidden.
Exactly. So these action-based logics are a really interesting way of trying to capture the close connection between norms and agency.
And this focus on actions also ties in with some of the criticisms of SDL's core principles that we discussed earlier, right? Like the necessitation rule and the rule of inheritance.
Right. Those principles were originally formulated in terms of propositions, But when you start thinking about actions, they can seem a lot more questionable.
So remind us, what are those principles again, and what are the problems with them?
Well, the necessitation rule, or OBNEC, says that if something's a logical truth, then it's obligatory. But when you think about it in terms of actions, it seems strange to say that you're obligated to do something that's logically guaranteed to happen anyway. Like, you're not really doing anything in those cases.
Right, it seems like a very empty kind of obligation.
Exactly. And the rule of inheritance, or OBRM, says that if P implies Q, and it's obligatory that P, then it's also obligatory that Q. But that leads to those weird paradoxes like Ross's paradox and the Good Samaritan paradox. Like in Ross's paradox, the obligation to mail a letter seems to imply an obligation to either mail it or burn it, because mailing it implies that you either mail it or burn it. But that seems crazy.
It does seem like a strange thing to be obligated to do. You're not really choosing anything in that case.
Right. And in the Good Samaritan paradox, the obligation to help someone who's been robbed seems to imply an obligation.